Hello and welcome back to the Crime Folio. We are a space for quiet contemplation, a repository for the stories that resist easy answers and echo through time. The ocean has always been a source of profound paradox. It is a symbol of life and boundless freedom, yet it is also a vast, indifferent wilderness. On land, a disappearance leaves traces, footprints, evidence, witnesses. But the sea is the ultimate accomplice. It swallows secrets whole, erases timelines, and conceals the truth beneath miles of cold, dark water. Tonight, we journey into that abyss, exploring the fates of those who were lost at sea, leaving behind only questions. Case 1. The disappearance of the Kaz-2, the ghost yacht. The story of the Kaz-2 is not a tale of storms or pirates or high-seas violence. It is a story of silence, a story defined not by what was found, but by what was missing. It begins, as many great adventures do, with friendship and a shared dream. Our subjects are three men from Perth, Western Australia. Derek Batten, 56, and his neighbors, brothers Peter Tunstead, 69, and James Tunstead, 63. They were not foolhardy novices venturing into the unknown. They were experienced men, bonded by years of friendship and a mutual love for the open water. Derek, known to his friends as Des, was the proud new owner of the Kaz-2. He was a retired manager, a man who had worked hard his entire life with the goal of one day sailing the coast of Australia. The Kaz-2, a sleek, 9.8-meter, 32-foot catamaran, was the culmination of that dream. It was his pride and joy, a vessel he had purchased specifically for this grand journey. Peter and James Tunstead were his trusted companions. Peter, the elder brother, was a retired cabinet maker, a man with a quiet competence and a lifetime of practical skills. James was a retired radio technician, a man who understood mechanics and communication. Both had considerable boating experience. Together, the three of them formed a capable and seasoned crew. Their plan was ambitious but well-conceived: to sail the Kaz-2 from Airlie Beach, a vibrant tourist town on the coast of Queensland, all the way around the top of Australia and back down to their homes in Perth. It was to be the trip of a lifetime, a celebration of retirement, friendship, and the freedom of the sea. On Sunday, April 15, 2007, the journey began. The sky was clear, the sea was calm. James Tunstead, holding a video camera, documented their departure from the Chute Harbour Marina. The footage captures the mood of the day perfectly. It is a scene of pure, unadulterated joy and anticipation. The men are smiling, laughing, waving to Des Batten's wife, Jennifer, who was filming them from the shore. The camera pans across the sparkling water, the distant islands, the modern dashboard of the Kaz-2. Des is at the helm, a picture of a man living his dream. Peter is seen rigging a fishing line off the stern. The atmosphere is light, relaxed, and full of promise. This video, meant to be a happy memento, would become the first and last chapter of a mystery. After waving goodbye, Jennifer Batten drove north to Townsville, where she planned to meet the men in a few days. They stayed in touch via phone calls. The last known direct contact was a satellite phone call from Peter Tunstead to his wife later that Sunday afternoon. He sounded happy. He reported that they were settling in, that the weather was beautiful, and that everything was going according to plan. All was well aboard the Kaz-2. And then silence. For the next 3 days, the Kaz-2 sailed on, a silent vessel on an empty sea. On the morning of Wednesday, April 18th, a coastal patrol helicopter was flying a routine mission off the coast of northern Queensland, near the Great Barrier Reef. The pilot spotted something unusual. A catamaran? Its sails up, drifting in a northerly direction. It didn't seem to be in distress, but its position, far out in a shipping channel, and its aimless course raised concern. The helicopter crew tried to make radio contact, but received no reply. They circled the vessel, their eyes scanning the deck for any sign of life. They saw none. The yacht was moving with the current, a silent, solitary shape against the vast blue canvas of the Coral Sea. The report was logged, but the yacht was not considered to be in immediate danger. It wasn't until 2 days later, on Friday, April 20th, that the mystery deepened into something truly unsettling. A Queensland emergency management helicopter was dispatched to the yacht's last known location. They found it easily, still drifting, now about 88 nautical miles, 163 kilometers, off the coast of Townsville. Maritime authorities were alerted, and a patrol boat was sent to intercept. As the authorities pulled alongside the CAS-2, the sense of unease grew. The boat was in perfect condition. There was no damage to the hull, no sign of a collision or having run aground. The 2 large white sails were up and full, though one was slightly shredded at the bottom, a common occurrence from wear and tear. The engine was running, set in neutral, its low hum the only sound breaking the silence of the sea. The anchor was up. A small inflatable dinghy was still hoisted in its proper place at the back of the boat. Everything on the exterior appeared normal, yet profoundly wrong. The boarding party climbed onto the deck, their boots echoing in the stillness. What they found inside the cabin would transform the story of the CAS-2 from a maritime incident into a modern-day legend, drawing comparisons to the infamous ghost ship, the Mary Celeste. The scene was one of suspended animation. On a table in the galley, a laptop computer was open and powered on. A meal was laid out, as if a dinner had been recently prepared or was about to be served. Plates, cutlery, and food were all in place. In the sleeping quarters, the beds were made, with clothes neatly folded beside them. Wallets, mobile phones, glasses, and a GPS unit were all in their places, untouched. A copy of the Sunday newspaper lay on a bench. Down below, the boat's radio and navigation systems were all fully functional. There were life jackets of various sizes stowed neatly in their lockers, none of them missing. The investigators moved through the vessel like archaeologists exploring a ruin, a place where time had suddenly stopped. The only thing missing was the crew. Derek Batten, Peter Tunstead, and James Tunstead had vanished. A massive air and sea search was launched immediately. It was one of the largest in Queensland's history, covering an area of more than 700 square nautical miles. For days, planes, helicopters, and boats scoured the ocean, hoping to find a trace of the 3 men. They found nothing. No bodies, no debris, no sign that anyone had ever been in the water. It was as if the men had been plucked from their vessel by an invisible hand, leaving behind all their worldly possessions and the life they had just begun to enjoy. With the search yielding no results, investigators turned their full attention to the silent witness, the boat itself. They had to piece together the final moments of the crew from the scant clues left behind. The 2 most important pieces of evidence were the ship's GPS and the video camera. The GPS data provided a digital ghost of the boat's journey. It showed the CAS-2 leaving Airlie Beach on Sunday, April 15th, and heading north. The course was steady for several hours. But then, late on Sunday afternoon, the boat's track became erratic. It veered sharply off its planned course and began to move with the current and the wind. This was the moment. Sometime on that Sunday afternoon, the CAS-2 had lost its captain. From that point on, it was a ghost ship, piloted only by the whims of the ocean. The video camera provided the human element to this timeline. The final clip, timestamped at 10:05 a.m. on Sunday, April 15th, showed a calm sea and a happy crew. Des Batten was at the helm. Peter Tunstead was seen fishing from the stern, a long white fishing lure trailing in the boat's wake. James Tunstead, filming, panned across the deck, capturing the idyllic scene. Less than a few hours after this footage was shot, something went catastrophically wrong. The public, captivated by the story, began to speculate wildly. Theories ranged from the plausible to the paranormal. Was it a freak wave that had washed all three experienced men overboard simultaneously, without damaging the boat or disturbing a single plate in the galley? Highly improbable. Had they been the victims of modern-day pirates or smugglers, who had boarded the vessel, murdered the crew, and disposed of their bodies, yet inexplicably left behind all their valuable possessions? The lack of any signs of a struggle or foul play made this theory seem unlikely. Had they stumbled upon some illegal activity and been silenced? Perhaps. Or had they met a more bizarre fate? UFO abductions and sea monster attacks were whispered about in online forums. The official investigation, however, had to remain grounded in the cold, hard evidence. Detectives and maritime experts meticulously re-examined every detail. They noted the slightly shredded sail. They noted the position of the fishing line. They noted the state of the fenders, which were out on the starboard side, suggesting the boat may have been preparing to dock or come alongside another vessel, though there was no evidence of this. The case fell to the Queensland coroner, Graham Cull. His job was to sift through the facts, the evidence, and the expert opinions to arrive at the most probable explanation for what happened to the three men. After months of investigation and a formal inquest, he delivered his findings in August 2008. His conclusion was not a dramatic tale of pirates or sea monsters. It was a far more terrifying story. A sequence of mundane accidents, a chain reaction of small, human errors that led to an unthinkable tragedy. It was a theory that became known as the one man overboard scenario. The coroner's narrative, built from the evidence, goes like this. It is Sunday afternoon, April 15th. The sea is becoming a bit choppy. The wind is picking up. The men are enjoying their first day at sea. James Tunstead, the younger of the two brothers, is at the back of the boat, perhaps checking on the fishing line he had set up earlier, the one seen in the video. As he leans over, he gets his line tangled, perhaps in the boat's rudder or one of its two propellers. It's a common, frustrating problem for boaters. In an attempt to free the lure, he loses his balance. Perhaps the boat lurches unexpectedly. He falls into the water. He is not wearing a life jacket. His brother, Peter, who is 69 years old, sees him go over. In a moment of panic and brotherly instinct, he rushes to his aid. He doesn't stop to think. He doesn't grab a life vest or a flotation device. He dives into the water to save his younger brother. Now, two men are in the water, struggling in the choppy seas, watching as their boat, still under sail and with its engine running, begins to move away from them. At the helm, Derek Batten, the 56-year-old skipper, realizes what has happened. He sees his two friends in the water. He immediately turns the boat around to execute a rescue. But in the rising wind, and with the large sails full, the maneuver is tricky. As he turns, the boat jibes, a term for when the stern passes through the wind, causing the boom, the heavy horizontal pole at the bottom of the mainsail, to swing violently and unexpectedly from one side of the boat to the other. It is a powerful, dangerous movement. As the boom whips across the deck, it strikes Derek Batten, knocking him unconscious or stunning him, and sweeping him overboard into the water. In the space of perhaps less than 2 minutes, a series of 3 simple sequential accidents has occurred. Now all 3 men are in the water. All 3 are without life jackets. They are watching their brand new, perfectly functional dream boat, their only hope of survival, sailing away from them, guided by the wind and the current. This single, terrifying theory explains almost everything. It explains why there were no signs of a struggle on board. It explains why the life jackets were all still in their lockers. It explains the running engine and the full sails. It explains the meal on the table. Perhaps Des was preparing it when the first incident occurred. It explains the sudden, erratic change in the boat's course on the GPS. It is a theory built on a cascade of bad luck and human error. The coroner, Graham Cull, concluded that the men had died as a result of a mishap, and that their bodies were likely lost at sea. He noted that their deaths highlighted the dangers of the ocean, even for experienced sailors, and the critical importance of wearing safety gear. For the families of the three men, the conclusion was both a relief and a source of enduring pain. It provided a plausible explanation, a way to make sense of the senseless. But it did not provide closure. Without bodies to bury, without a final, certain answer, a sliver of doubt will always remain. Jennifer Batten, Des's wife, spoke of the torment of not knowing for sure. Was it a simple accident? Or was there something more sinister at play that the investigation had missed? The story of the Cas-2 has become a cautionary tale in the maritime community, a somber reminder of how quickly a dream voyage can turn into a nightmare. It is a testament to the unforgiving nature of the sea, an environment where there is no room for error. The boat itself, the ghost yacht, sits as a lonely monument to its lost crew. It did not fail them. The sea did not conjure a monster to attack them. Instead, it seems the most mundane of circumstances. A tangled fishing line, a moment of panic, and an opportune gust of wind conspired to create a perfect and fatal storm of misfortune. The silence they left behind is perhaps the most haunting part of the story, a profound and empty space filled only by the sound of the wind and the endless, indifferent ocean. Case 2. The Scott Watson case and the disappearance of Ben and Olivia. While the mystery of the Cas-2 is one of silent, empty space, our next story is one of noise and crowds, a celebration that dissolved into a national mystery. It is a case that has haunted New Zealand for decades, a story with a beginning, a middle, but an ending that remains fiercely contested, buried somewhere in the cold, deep waters of the Marlborough Sounds. The last day of 1997 dawned bright and hopeful over the Sounds, a breathtaking labyrinth of sunken river valleys, dense green forests, and sheltered coves at the northern tip of New Zealand's South Island. It's a paradise for boaters, a place of stunning beauty and profound isolation. For thousands of young New Zealanders, it was the traditional setting for a New Year's Eve rite of passage. A massive, water-based party centered around the historic Furno Lodge in Endeavour Inlet. Among the revelers that year were Ben Smart, 21, and Olivia Hope, 17. They were young, vibrant, and on the cusp of the rest of their lives. Ben was a charming and confident young man. Olivia was bright and full of energy. They were good friends, part of a larger group that had traveled to the Sounds to ring in the new year. They arrived with friends aboard a yacht called the Tamarack, joining a flotilla of hundreds of other boats and a raucous crowd of over 1,500 people at the lodge. The atmosphere was electric. Music pulsed from the lodge, echoing across the water. People mingled, danced, and celebrated the promise of 1998. Ben and Olivia were in the heart of it all, enjoying the party with their friends. As the night wore on and the new year was welcomed, the festivities began to wind down. Sometime after 4 a.m. on January 1st, a tired but happy Ben and Olivia decided it was time to head back to the Tamarack to sleep. But there was a problem. The yacht's bunks were all full. It was a minor logistical issue, one that seemed easily solved in the communal spirit of the night. A water taxi was ferrying partygoers back to their boats. The skipper was a man named Guy Wallace. Ben and Olivia boarded his small boat, along with a few other passengers, including a friend of Olivia's, Hayden Morrissey. Their plan was to find another boat in their group to sleep on. As Wallace's taxi motored through the dark, crowded anchorage, they flagged down another yacht, the Alliance, where they knew friends were staying. But the Alliance was also full. This is the moment where the story pivots, where a simple search for a place to sleep becomes the prologue to a double disappearance. As Ben and Olivia stood on the deck of the Alliance, talking to their friends, another man on the water taxi spoke up. He was alone, and he offered them a place to stay on his yacht. He was described by those who saw him as unshaven and scruffy, a solitary figure amidst the cheerful groups. Guy Wallace, the water taxi driver, would later recall the man gesturing vaguely towards a larger, older-looking yacht moored nearby. It was a Quechua two-masted sailing vessel. The offer seemed like a simple act of kindness from a fellow boater. Ben and Olivia, weary from the long night, accepted. Guy Wallace steered his water taxi over to the mysterious ketch. He watched as Ben and Olivia, along with the unknown man, climbed aboard. He saw Olivia turn and give a friendly, final wave. It was the last time Ben Smart and Olivia Hope were ever seen by anyone who could reliably identify them. The next morning, the sun rose on a new year. As the partygoers awoke and the fog of the previous night's celebration began to lift, a sense of unease settled over Ben and Olivia's friends. They hadn't returned. They weren't on the Tamarack or the Alliance. No one had seen them since they'd boarded the stranger's ketch. Initial concern soon blossomed into full-blown panic. A search was launched. Their parents were called. The police were notified. The investigation began immediately, but it was a logistical nightmare. The crime scene, if there was one, was a vast, fluid network of waterways. The potential witnesses were thousands of people, most of whom had been drinking, scattered across hundreds of boats, many of which had already left the Sounds. The first, most critical task was to identify the mystery man and his two-masted ketch. Police began the painstaking process of tracking down every ketch that had been in Endeavour Inlet that night. They appealed to the public for information. Witness descriptions of the man and his boat were varied and often contradictory, a common issue in such a chaotic environment. Some described the ketch as having a distinctive blue stripe. Others remembered it as being white and run down. As the investigation intensified, the focus began to shift to all single men who had been at Furno Lodge that night and who owned a boat. One name that came up was Scott Watson. Scott Watson, 26 at the time, was a local man who lived on his boat. He was known in the small community as a loner, a man with a short temper and a history of petty crime. He owned a homemade, single-masted sloop, a different type of sailboat from a ketch which he had named Blade. He had been at the Furno Lodge party, arriving and leaving alone. He fit the profile of a solitary male boater. When police first interviewed Watson, he was evasive and uncooperative. He claimed he had left the party long before Ben and Olivia disappeared and had spent the rest of the night on his boat alone. But his story had inconsistencies. Eyewitnesses placed him at the dock around the same time Ben and Olivia were looking for a ride. The investigation began to focus intently on Scott Watson. On January 12th, 12 days after the disappearance, police seized his boat, the Blade. What they found, or rather, what they noticed, was that the boat appeared to have been meticulously cleaned. The interior smelled of cleaning agents. This raised immediate suspicion. Why would a man who lived on his boat, a man known for his untidy habits, suddenly scrub it from top to bottom just days after two people went missing from the same area? The physical evidence, however, was frustratingly scarce. The Marlborough Sounds are deep, with powerful currents. If Ben and Olivia had been murdered and their bodies disposed of in the water, finding them would be next to impossible. The police were left with a mystery with no bodies, no murder weapon, and no confession. The entire case would have to be built on circumstantial evidence. And the cornerstone of that circumstantial case was a single glaring problem: the boat. Eyewitnesses, most notably the water taxi driver Guy Wallace, were initially adamant that the vessel Ben and Olivia had boarded was a ketch, a two-masted boat. Scott Watson's Blade was a sloop with only one mast. They were fundamentally different boats. For the police theory to work, they had to prove that all these witnesses were wrong. This led to the controversial two-trip theory. The prosecution would later argue that Guy Wallace had made two separate trips to drop off passengers. They claimed that on the first trip, he had dropped off Scott Watson, who had then returned to the main dock. On the second trip, Wallace picked up Ben and Olivia. It was at this point, the theory goes, that Watson, now back at the jetty, intercepted them and offered them a ride, taking them not to a ketch but to his sloop, the Blade. This theory was critical to placing Watson with the victims, but it was complex and heavily contested. It also required the police to address the witness sightings of the ketch. Over time, and after repeated police interviews, the recollections of several key witnesses began to shift. Guy Wallace, who had initially been firm about the ketch, later became less certain, eventually identifying Watson's sloop in a photo lineup as a boat that was similar to the one he had dropped the trio at. The defense would later argue that this was a classic case of witness memory contamination, where police suggestion and the pressure of a high-profile investigation led people to doubt their own initial recollections. The physical evidence against Watson was thin but potent. Investigators found two long, blonde hairs on a tiger-striped blanket taken from Watson's boat. DNA testing, in its relative infancy in 1998, revealed that the hairs were not from Watson. A more advanced mitochondrial DNA test was conducted, comparing the hairs to hair samples from Olivia Hope's mother. The results showed a match. The prosecution argued this was their smoking gun. Olivia Hope had been on Scott Watson's boat. The defense countered that this proved nothing more than possible secondary transfer. The blanket had been taken off the boat and handled by several people before being secured as evidence. The hairs could have been transferred from someone who had simply been near Olivia at the party. Another piece of evidence was a deep scratch found on the hatch of Watson's boat. The prosecution contended that a fender from the Tamarack boat Ben and Olivia had come on had made this scratch when the Blade pulled alongside it. They argued it was proof that Watson's boat had been next to the Tamarack in the early hours of the morning. The defense argued it was just a scratch, one of many on an old boat. The police also focused on Watson's movements in the days after the disappearance. He had sailed north to the town of Erie Bay. The prosecution alleged that during this trip, he had stopped in a remote cove and painted his boat, attempting to change its appearance. They also claimed he had dumped Ben and Olivia's bodies at sea, weighted down so they would never be found. Watson maintained he had simply gone on a planned sailing trip. In June 1999, 15 months after Ben and Olivia vanished, Scott Watson went on trial for their murders. The case captivated New Zealand. It was a trial built almost entirely on a chain of circumstantial links. The prosecution presented its narrative. Scott Watson was a sexual predator who had stalked young women at the party. Rejected and angry, he saw an opportunity when he encountered Ben and Olivia. He lured them back to his boat with a false promise of a place to stay. Once there, he murdered them, likely after a sexual assault on Olivia, then disposed of their bodies in the vast, deep waters of the Cook Strait, before methodically cleaning his boat to destroy all evidence. They presented the hair evidence, the boat scratch, the testimony of jailhouse informants who claimed Watson had confessed to them, and the shifted recollections of the eyewitnesses. The defense presented a counter-narrative of a flawed investigation and a rush to judgment. They argued that the police, under immense public pressure to solve the case, had suffered from tunnel vision, They had decided early on that Watson was their man and had then worked to make the evidence fit their theory, ignoring anything that contradicted it. They hammered on the catch. The mystery man and the mystery catch were real, they argued, and the police had simply failed to find them. They attacked the credibility of the jailhouse informants. They presented expert testimony suggesting the two-trip theory was physically impossible within the known timeline. They argued that Scott Watson was an unfortunate scapegoat, an unpopular local who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. After a grueling 3-month trial, the jury delivered its verdict. They found Scott Watson guilty on 2 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years. For the families of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope, the verdict provided a measure of justice, but not closure. Their children were still gone. Their bodies had never been found. They were left with a conviction, but also with the agonizing, unanswered question of where their children lay. In the years since the trial, the Scott Watson case has become one of the most debated and controversial in New Zealand's history. A dedicated and vocal group of supporters, including journalists, lawyers, and Watson's own family, have tirelessly campaigned for his innocence. They have published books, produced documentaries, and filed numerous appeals, all pointing to the perceived flaws in the investigation and the circumstantial nature of the evidence. They maintain that a grave miscarriage of justice occurred. The core of the debate always comes back to the same 2 points: the catch and the lack of bodies. Was the mystery catch a collective misremembering, a red herring in a sea of confusion? Or was it a real vessel, whose owner slipped away in the dawn of New Year's Day, carrying with him a terrible secret? And without the bodies of Ben and Olivia, can anyone ever be truly certain of what happened in the dark, early hours of January 1st, 1998? The sea holds the answer. The Marlborough Sounds, so beautiful on the surface, became the final, silent witness to the fate of 2 young people. Whether they met their end at the hands of Scott Watson on his lonely sloop, or at the hands of a still unknown man on a phantom ketch, the outcome is the same. The celebration ended in silence. The promise of a new year was extinguished before it could even begin. And the only certainty in the entire tragic story is the void they left behind, a void that no court verdict can ever truly fill. Case 3. The Mysterious Death of Natalie Wood. Our journey now takes us from the rugged shores of New Zealand to the glittering, myth-laden coast of Southern California. Here, the sea was not the backdrop for a rite of passage, but for the exclusive leisure of Hollywood royalty. This is a story that has been whispered about for over 4 decades. A tale of fame, love, jealousy, and a death that has stubbornly refused to align with its official explanation. It is the story of a movie star who possessed a lifelong, well-documented terror of dark water, and who, against all logic, met her end in its cold embrace. This is the mystery of Natalie Wood. By 1981, Natalie Wood was more than just an actress. She was a Hollywood institution. From a captivating child star in films like Miracle on 34th Street to a troubled teen icon in Rebel Without a Cause and a mature leading lady in West Side Story, her life had been lived in the public eye. She was a 3-time Oscar nominee, a woman of luminous beauty and immense talent. Her personal life was just as famous, dominated by her epic, twice-enacted love story with the handsome and successful actor Robert Wagner. They were Hollywood's golden couple, their romance a narrative of its own, married in 1957, divorced in 1962, and, in a move that delighted romantics everywhere, remarried a decade later in 1972. Their vessel, the 60-foot yacht named Splendor, was a symbol of this rekindled love and their glamorous life. It was their sanctuary, a floating retreat from the pressures of fame. But it was a sanctuary that held a deep and terrible irony for Natalie. Since a childhood accident on a film set, Where a bridge collapsed and she was trapped in the water, Natalie would have harbored a profound phobia of the ocean. Her fear was not a casual dislike. It was a deep-seated terror. Her sister, Lana would later say Natalie was so afraid she wouldn't even go near a swimming pool if the water was dark. On Thanksgiving weekend of 1981, the Splendor was moored off the coast of Santa Catalina Island, a picturesque getaway 22 miles from the Los Angeles shoreline. On board with Natalie and Robert Wagner, whom she affectionately called RJ, were two other men. One was Dennis Davern, the yacht's young captain, a man who had worked for the couple for years and considered them friends. The other was a guest, the intense, acclaimed actor Christopher Walken. Walken was Natalie's co-star in her final, unfinished film, a science fiction thriller called Brainstorm. The weekend was supposed to be a pleasant holiday escape. But beneath the surface of glamour and relaxation, tensions were simmering. There were whispers of professional jealousy. Natalie was deeply invested in her role in Brainstorm, and her on-screen chemistry and off-screen friendship with Walken had reportedly become a source of irritation for Wagner. On Saturday, November 28th, the trio Natalie, RJ, and Walken spent the day ashore. They had lunch and drinks at Doug's Harbor Reef, a waterfront restaurant in the island's main town of Avalon. By all accounts, the afternoon was filled with champagne and boisterous conversation. That evening, they returned to the restaurant for dinner. The drinking continued. The mood, however, began to sour. Witnesses at the restaurant would later recall the group's conversation growing louder, more intense. After dinner, they returned to the Splendor. It was here, in the close, isolated confines of the yacht's main salon, that the evening's tensions erupted into open conflict. The official story, the one that would be told for 30 years, was a sanitized version of events. But decades later, through the shifting testimony of the only other witness, Captain Dennis Davern, a darker picture would emerge. According to Davern's later accounts, the argument began over Natalie's career. Wagner, allegedly fueled by alcohol and jealousy, began to berate Walken, accusing him of trying to interfere in his wife's life and career choices. The argument escalated. At one point, a furious Wagner allegedly picked up a bottle of wine, smashed it on the table, and screamed at Walken, "What are you trying to do? Fuck my wife." Walken, taken aback by the venom of the outburst, retreated to his cabin and closed the door. But the argument was not over. It now shifted, becoming a private, heated confrontation between husband and wife. According to Davern, Natalie and Wagner moved from the salon out to the aft deck of the yacht, their angry voices carrying on the cold night air. Davern, trying to give them privacy, turned up the volume on the stereo. After a time, the sounds of the argument stopped. All he could hear was the music and the gentle lapping of the water against the hull. A profound and sudden silence had fallen over the Splendor. A short while later, Robert Wagner appeared. He was, in Davern's recollection, disheveled and agitated. "Natalie's missing," he said. He noted that the yacht's inflatable dinghy, a small rubber boat named Valiant, was also gone. This is the point where the official narrative and the later allegations diverge most critically. The story initially told to police was that after the argument, Natalie had gone to her stateroom. Wagner assumed she had gone to bed. When he went to check on her around 11:45 p.m., he found she wasn't there. He and Davern searched the yacht, realized she and the dinghy were missing, and after a short period, called for help. Davern's later account paints a picture of deliberate, fatal delay. He claimed that after Wagner announced Natalie was missing, Davern immediately wanted to turn on the yacht's powerful searchlights and call the Coast Guard. But Wagner, he alleged, stopped him. "Let's not do anything right now," Wagner supposedly said. Let's just wait and see if she comes back. Davern claimed Wagner was concerned about the negative publicity, the scandal that a public search would ignite. According to this version of events, precious, life-saving time was wasted. It wasn't until 1:30 a.m., more than an hour after she was known to be missing, that a call was made to the harbormaster. The Coast Guard was not officially notified until 3:30 a.m. A search was launched into the darkness. But it was too late. At 7:45 the next morning, Sunday, November 29th, the search came to a grim end. Natalie Wood's body was found floating in the water, about a mile away from the Splendor and 200 yards off the shore of a small cove. She was dressed in a flannel nightgown, wool socks, and a red down jacket. The inflatable dinghy was found beached nearby, its ignition off, its oars locked in place. The initial autopsy was conducted by Dr. Thomas Noguchi, the famous coroner to the stars. He found that Natalie's blood alcohol level was 0.14%, well over the legal driving limit. He also noted some superficial bruises on her arms and a scratch on her cheek. The conclusion he reached would define the case for decades. He ruled her death an accidental drowning. The official theory was born. In a fit of pique after the argument, Natalie, unable to sleep, decided to leave the Splendor and take the dinghy to shore. While trying to board or untie the small boat, she slipped on the yacht's swim step, which was notoriously slick. She may have hit her head, been knocked unconscious, and fallen into the 55-degree water. The heavy, waterlogged down jacket would have pulled her under quickly. It was a tragic accident, fueled by alcohol and a moment of poor judgment. The case was closed. Robert Wagner was a grieving widower. Christopher Walken was a traumatized witness. The world mourned the loss of a star. For 30 years, that was the story. But the questions never truly went away. They lingered in the public consciousness, fueled by the central, nagging contradiction. Why would a woman with a pathological fear of dark water attempt to board a small, unstable boat, alone in the middle of the night in her nightclothes? It seemed profoundly out of character. The story refused to stay buried. In 2009, Dennis Davern, in collaboration with author Marty Rully, published a book titled Goodbye Natalie, Goodbye Splendor. In it, he laid out his full, revised account of the night, including the violent argument, Wagner's alleged jealousy, and the crucial, deliberate delay in calling for help. He confessed that he had lied in his initial statements to police, claiming Wagner had coached him on what to say and had impressed upon him the need to protect the family's image. Davern's book, along with his repeated public statements, created a seismic shift. The pressure mounted on the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department to take another look. In November 2011, almost exactly 30 years to the day after her death, the case of Natalie Wood's death was officially reopened. Investigators said the decision was based on new and substantial information provided by Davern and other witnesses who had come forward over the years. Robert Wagner released a statement through his publicist, saying he supported the new investigation and trusted the Sheriff's Department to evaluate whether the new information was credible. The reopening of the case led to a new, more thorough examination of the original evidence. In 2012, the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office made a stunning announcement. They were officially changing Natalie Wood's cause of death. It was no longer accidental drowning. The amended death certificate now read, drowning and other undetermined factors. The chief medical examiner explained the change, citing the presence of the bruises. The original report had downplayed them, but a reevaluation suggested they might be more significant. The new report noted fresh bruises on Natalie's right forearm, left wrist, and right knee, along with a scratch on her neck. Crucially, the coroner stated, this examiner is unable to exclude non-accidental mechanism causing these injuries. Since there are many unanswered questions and limited additional evidence available for evaluation, it is opined by this medical examiner that the manner of death should be left as undetermined. The official acknowledgement that her death might not have been an accident was a bombshell. It validated the doubts that had persisted for 3 decades. The story was no longer about a simple slip and fall. It was now a potential homicide investigation. The focus inevitably fell back on the 3 men who were on the Splendor that night. Christopher Walken cooperated with the new investigation, hiring a lawyer and giving a statement that was consistent with what he had always maintained. He was in his cabin when Natalie went missing and had no knowledge of what transpired on the deck. Dennis Davern became the key witness for the prosecution, repeating his story of the fight and the delayed search. Robert Wagner, however, took a different approach. After his initial statement of support, he declined, through his attorney, to be re-interviewed by detectives. His story remained the same as it had been in 1981. It was a tragic accident, and he had nothing more to add. Then, in February 2018, the investigation reached its most dramatic point. In an interview with the television program 48 Hours, Lieutenant John Corina of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department stated that Robert Wagner was now officially a person of interest in his wife's death. He emphasized that the timeline Wagner provided didn't add up and that his refusal to speak with them was suspicious. "He is a person of interest because he was the last one with Natalie Wood," Corina said. "And now he's telling a story that doesn't add up. Being named a person of interest is not the same as being named a suspect or being charged with a crime. It is a formal acknowledgement that investigators believe he may have information critical to the case." To this day, Wagner has never been charged. He has maintained his silence and his innocence. And so, the mystery endures, suspended in a state of perpetual ambiguity. The truth of what happened on the Splendor is locked away, fragmented between the conflicting memories and agendas of the men who were there. Did Natalie Wood, in a moment of alcohol-fueled anger, try to leave the yacht and tragically fall? Or did the argument on the deck turn physical? Did she fall overboard during a struggle? Was she pushed? Did she end up in the water, injured and alive, only to be left there, her pleas for help ignored as the lights of the Splendor remained dark? The sea, as always, holds its secrets close. It gave back Natalie Wood's body, but it kept the story of her final moments. What remains is a portrait of a vibrant life cut short, and a cloud of suspicion that has shadowed a Hollywood legend for more than half his life. The case of Natalie Wood is a chilling reminder that even in a world of glamour and fame, the most fundamental truths can be as deep, as dark, and as unknowable as the ocean itself. Case 4. The Seawind Murders of the Mac Grahams. The final story in our exploration of maritime mysteries takes us to a place of unparalleled, desolate beauty, the Palmyra Atoll. It is not an island in the conventional sense, but a tiny, remote ring of coral islets and reefs in the North Pacific Ocean, roughly 1,000 miles south of Hawaii. It is a place of breathtaking isolation, uninhabited save for a transient population of scientists and conservationists. In the 1970s, it was almost completely untouched by the outside world, a true deserted island paradise. It was this promise of pristine solitude that drew a wealthy and experienced sailing couple, Malcolm Mac Graham III and his wife, Eleanor Muff Graham, to its shores. But the paradise they sought would become their tomb, the setting for a grim tale of class conflict, desperation, and murder on the high seas. Mac and Muff Graham were a picture of success and adventure. Mac, 43, was a skilled blue water sailor who had navigated the world's oceans. Muff, 41, was his capable and constant companion. They were living a life many only dream of, sailing the Pacific aboard their magnificent 38-foot ketch, the Seawind. The boat was their home, a vessel meticulously cared for, a symbol of their freedom and affluence. In the summer of 1974, after years of planning, they arrived at Palmyra, dropping anchor in its turquoise lagoon. They had found their Eden. They were not, however, entirely alone. Palmyra, for all its isolation, occasionally attracted other intrepid sailors. Shortly after the Grahams arrived, another vessel entered the lagoon. It was the Iola, a small, dilapidated, and barely seaworthy sailboat. On board were Buck Dwayne Walker and his girlfriend, Stephanie Stearns. They were a stark contrast to the Grahams. Walker was a fugitive, an ex-convict who had escaped from a drug possession charge in Hawaii. He was rough, charismatic, and unpredictable. Stearns was a young woman captivated by Walker's anti-establishment persona, following him on a journey that was less about idyllic sailing and more about escaping the law. Their boat, the Iola, was a reflection of their desperate circumstances. It was poorly maintained and ill-equipped for a long voyage. Soon after arriving at Palmyra, the Iola ran aground on a reef, damaging its hull. They were stranded. For a time, an uneasy peace existed in the lagoon. The two couples were the only 4 people on the atoll. The Grahams, with their beautiful boat and plentiful supplies, represented everything Walker and Stearns lacked. Mac and Muff were initially friendly, sharing meals and supplies with the stranded couple. But a tension began to build, a palpable friction born of their vastly different worlds. The Grahams were self-sufficient and private. Walker and Stearns were becoming increasingly dependent and resentful. Mac grew wary of Walker, whose criminal past he was likely unaware of, but whose volatile nature was becoming apparent. He began to avoid him, a social snub that, in such an isolated environment, was a profound statement. The last known contact anyone had with the Grahams was a radio call they made to a fellow sailor in late August 1974. In the call, they mentioned the other couple on the island and seemed to hint at a growing unease. After that transmission, the Sea Wind, Mac, and Muff Graham went silent. For 6 years, their fate was a complete mystery. They had simply vanished. Their friends and family assumed they had been lost at sea, victims of a storm or a tragic accident. The vastness of the Pacific had claimed another vessel. Then, in 1980, the story took a stunning turn. Tourists walking along a remote beach in Hawaii, on the island of Oahu, discovered a skeletal human hand and a skull washed ashore. Forensic analysis identified the remains. They belonged to Eleanor Muff Graham. The discovery proved that at least one of the Grahams had not been lost in a storm at sea. They had been the victim of something far more sinister. The investigation into their disappearance was reignited with a new and terrible certainty. This was now a homicide case. The focus immediately turned to the only other people known to have been on Palmyra Atoll with the Grahams, Buck Walker and Stephanie Stearns. Investigators began to piece together what Walker and Stearns had done after the Grahams vanished. They discovered that in October 1974, 2 months after the Grahams' last radio call, a magnificent ketch had sailed into the Ala Harbor in Honolulu. It was the Sea Wind. On board were Buck Walker and Stephanie Stearns. The boat had been crudely repainted, its name changed to the Iola. But it was unmistakably the Grahams' vessel. Their arrival had not gone unnoticed. Friends of the Grahams recognized the distinctive boat despite the poor paint job. Suspicious, they contacted the authorities. Walker and Stearns were arrested, but not for murder at the time. There was no proof of any foul play against the Grahams. They were arrested for the theft of the Sea Wind. Their story to the police was a tangled web of claims. They alleged that they had found the Sea Wind adrift and abandoned in Palmyra's lagoon. They claimed the Grahams must have had a boating accident, perhaps in their small dinghy, and drowned. Seeing the abandoned vessel as a lucky break, away off the island, they had simply taken it. Stephanie Stearns, in her interviews, seemed to genuinely believe this version of events, or at least she clung to it. Buck Walker, the more dominant and manipulative of the two, controlled the narrative. Without bodies or any evidence of a crime, prosecutors could only convict them on the theft charge. In 1975, Stephanie Stearns was found guilty and served a short sentence. Buck Walker was also convicted, but given his prior record, he received a longer sentence. While in federal prison for the boat theft, he managed to escape, but was later recaptured. For years, that's where the story stood. But the discovery of Muff Graham's remains in 1980 changed everything. The investigation now shifted back to Palmyra. In 1981, FBI agents and naval investigators traveled to the remote atoll. They began a painstaking search of the island, focusing on the area where the Sea Wind and the Iola had been anchored. Their search led them to a rusty, water-filled metal container that had washed ashore years ago from a World War II-era shipwreck. They drained the container, and inside, buried under mud and silt, they found a human skeleton. Dental records confirmed it was the body of Mac Graham. The skeleton told a grim story. There were clear signs of trauma. Mac Graham had been beaten, and his body showed signs that it had been burned, likely with a cutting torch. The discovery of the body, coupled with his wife's remains found a year earlier, provided the corpus delicti, the concrete proof of a crime that had been missing for years. The case against Buck Walker and Stephanie Stearns was now one of double murder. The prosecution, led by a determined U.S. attorney named Vincent Bugliosifimus for prosecuting Charles Manson, began to construct the narrative of what they believed truly happened on Palmyra in the late summer of 1974. Their theory was one of cold-blooded, opportunistic murder. Walker and Stearns were stranded, their boat useless, their supplies dwindling. They saw the Sea Wind not just as a boat, but as a lifeline, a ticket to freedom and a new life. They coveted it. The Grahams, with their wealth and self-sufficiency, were the only obstacle. The prosecution argued that on or around August 28, 1974, Walker, likely alone, ambushed and murdered Mac and Muff Graham. He then disposed of their bodies, weighing them down and sinking them in the deep lagoon. He took possession of their magnificent yacht, a prize he had won through violence. The prosecution's timeline was meticulous. They presented evidence that Walker and Stearns had remained on Palmyra for nearly 2 months after the murders, waiting for the right time to sail. They argued this was when Walker repainted the boat and sorted through the Grahams' possessions. He had stolen not just their boat, but their lives. In 1985, 11 years after the murders, Buck Walker stood trial in San Francisco. He was tried separately from Stearns. The case was built on circumstantial evidence, but it was powerful. The motive was clear: desperation and greed. The opportunity was undeniable. They were the only 4 people on the island, and the evidence of the stolen boat and the hidden bodies was damning. Walker, ever the defiant con man, chose to represent himself for part of the trial, a move that likely did him no favors. The jury found him guilty of the murder of Muff Graham. He was sentenced to life in prison. He was never tried for Mac's murder, as it was deemed unnecessary given the life sentence. The following year, 1986, it was Stephanie Stearns' turn. Her trial was a far more complex and emotionally charged affair. Her defense attorney, the legendary Vincent Bugliosi, had, in a strange twist of fate, switched sides. After prosecuting Walker, he was now defending Stearns. He had become convinced of her innocence. Bugliosi's defense was powerful. He painted a picture of Stephanie Stearns not as a co-conspirator, but as another of Buck Walker's victims. He argued she was a naive young woman, manipulated and controlled by a charismatic sociopath. Bugliosi contended that Walker had committed the murders alone, without Stearns's knowledge. He would have told her the same story he told the police, that the Grahams had disappeared in a boating accident. She, isolated and dependent on Walker for her very survival, would have had no reason and no power to question him. Bugliosi's key argument was that there was no physical evidence whatsoever linking Stearns to the murders. Her fingerprints were not on any potential weapon. There was no witness to her involvement. The entire case against her rested on the assumption that she must have known, that she must have been a willing participant. Bugliosi argued that this was not enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Could she have lived on that tiny atoll for 2 months with a murderer, aboard a stolen boat, and not known the truth? It seemed improbable, but, as Bugliosi forcefully argued, not impossible. The jury was faced with a difficult choice. They had to look into the heart of a complex, manipulative relationship and decide where naivete ended and complicity began. After long deliberation, they acquitted her. They found that the prosecution had not met its burden of proof. Stephanie Stearns, after 12 years living under the shadow of murder, walked free. She changed her name and disappeared into a private life. Buck Walker remained in prison, maintaining his innocence to the end. He died in 2010. The full, detailed truth of what transpired between the 4 people in that lonely lagoon died with him. Did he act alone? Was Stephanie Stearns truly an unwitting pawn in his deadly game? Or was she a clever actress who convinced a jury of her innocence? The Palmyra Atoll murders, the case of the sea wind, stand as a dark parable. It is a story about the collision of worlds, about how the isolation of paradise can strip away the veneer of civilization and expose the most brutal human impulses. The Grahams went to Palmyra seeking tranquility and beauty, but they found death. The turquoise water of the lagoon, which seemed to promise a pristine escape, became a graveyard. The sea eventually gave back their bodies, but the complete truth of their final days remains a secret, whispered only by the wind and the waves on a remote Pacific atoll. From a ghost yacht sailing on an empty sea, to a New Year's party that ended in a nation's enduring mystery. From the death of a star in the dark waters off Catalina, to a paradise that became a crime scene. The sea is a realm of profound and often terrible secrets. It is a force that can give life, but it can also take it away with an indifference that is both awesome and terrifying. The stories of those lost in its embrace are a testament to its power, and to the questions that will forever linger, just beneath the surface, in the silent, waiting deep. For now, from all of us at the Crime Folio, we wish you a safe and peaceful night. Sleep well,